From Oxford, Ohio, it's senior day and family weekend. Miami takes on Western Michigan for the first time since 2019 here at home in Yager Stadium. It's been an off and on season for the Miami RedHawks, but they look to get back on track against a Western Michigan opponent that has struggled this year as well. Hello, I'm Zach Rengers, host for today's game. I'll hand it off to Luke and Jack later on for our game coverage. But to start off the game, let's set up the matchup. The last meeting between these two teams was 10-12-19. That was a W for Western Michigan. In fact, they've won the last 7 meetings dating back all the way to 2004. It's hard to believe there's only been 7 meetings in that time frame for two teams that are in the same conference. But being one team from the West, one team from the East, it just doesn't line up to where they play each year like you would expect them to. The all-time series has been dominated by Miami, however, at 37 wins, 23 losses, and 1 tie. And Miami coming into this matchup is 22-9-1 at home. Like we mentioned, it's senior day here at Miami. Always a nice tradition to honor those seniors. We've got 20 seniors to be honored tonight. It is also the Cancer Awareness game where each player on the team will be wearing a different cancer-colored ribbon to get recognition for that cancer that they are supporting today. Let's look at the tail of the tape between these two squads. Western Michigan, the Broncos coming into this one, we mentioned earlier, they have struggled this year. 2-5 at 1-2 in the MAC, and they are on a 2-game loss streak. For a team that was once very overpowered in the MAC, some would say that they had that undefeated run going into the early 2010s. They were certainly a powerhouse of this conference. They've kind of been brought down to the level of everyone else, and they have struggled this year. They come in at 11th in the MAC in total offense at 305.7 yards per game. And luckily for them, they are facing the worst offensive team in the MAC in Miami today. We'll get to that later, however. Their last game was a 14-33 loss against Ohio, who this is an Ohio team. You saw some of the stat lines against other opponents like Kent State. They can certainly shock some teams. They're a high-powered offensive team, and they put up a lot of points this year, and they showed it in this game against Western Michigan last week. In that game, Western Michigan had 17 first downs, 10 rushing, 10 passing, 5 rushing, 10 passing, and 2 were via penalty on Ohio. They had 84 yards rushing, not a very impressive clip, and 249 yards passing in that game. Obviously, this is a pass-heavy team. They're going to try to open up the pass game through play actions by running the ball early, but they have struggled to do that and find their identity in the ground game up to this point this year. They come in with a redshirt freshman quarterback in Jack Salopek, who's got 249 yards last week. He had 1 touchdown but 5 interceptions, and that has really been his Achilles heel. He was 17 for 31 last week, so not ultra accurate, and he's thrown a lot of interceptions, certainly showing the lack of experience in the pocket for Western Michigan. He's got 1,231 yards on the year with only 7 TDs, however, and 10 interceptions across the board. So certainly a team that has struggled to take care of the ball, and that's really been the storyline for Western Michigan coming into this one. But they do have a nice receiver in the core, a junior Corey Cromes, who had 5 receptions, 87 yards, and 1 touchdown last week. He's got 32 receptions and 452 yards with 4 TDs on the year. Sean Tyler, their running back for Western Michigan, has had himself a pretty nice year. Had 19 attempts for 90 yards last week. He's knocking on the door of 100 attempts on the year, got 419 yards with 3 TDs to show for it thus far through the season. Sean Tyler could be a big piece to this game if Western Michigan tries to open up the passing game through the run game. But this is a Miami defense who is stout in run defense, and they're one of the best teams in the MAC in that category. Looking on the defense for Western Michigan, Zaire Barnes, the DB, he had 13 total tackles and 1 fumble recovery last week. He's got 65 total tackles and 1 forced fumble on the year as well. This guy's a monster in the secondary for Western Michigan. Look for him to have a big night today against Miami. Corvette Moment, he's had himself a good year on the linebacking core as well. 9 total tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss last week. 50 total tackles on the year and 3 sacks for Moment thus far in the year for Western Michigan. Now let's head to the Miami RedHawks. The home team, they're looking to get off the schneid. They suffered an absolutely brutal loss last week at Bowling Green State University. Not a game that they felt they should have lost. They find themselves at 4th in the MAC East at 3-4 and 1-2 overall in this year. Not where they wanted to be coming in this year. Obviously, they've struggled at the quarterback position. Avion Smith has been the guy thus far ever since the injury to Brett Gabbard, and they have really struggled with him at the helm. But good news, he's back. Brett Gabbard starting today, just a few weeks removed from that broken collarbone. We saw him take some reps in practice without a sling this week. He's been elevated to the starter again for Miami. So look for that offense to be back into some type of rhythm that they've had in past years. They come in at 303 yards per game. That's good for 12th in the MAC. They are the bottom team in the MAC in terms of offense, and that is shown in terms of their inconsistency in these games that they've lost and won. Last week's game, we mentioned it was a 17-13 loss, absolute heartbreaker at Bowling Green. They had 10 first downs, 4 rushing, 4 passing, and 2 penalty first downs. They only had 98 yards in the run game and 91 yards passing. Avion Smith was 9 for 17 for 91 yards with 1 touchdown, but he did have 55 yards on the ground. He comes into this one having 735 passing yards under his belt with 7 TDs, and he has gotten to over 350 rush yards as well, but it has really not been enough to lift this Miami squad to some wins that they desperately needed down the stretch, and I think that really put a lot of pressure on Brett Gabbard to get back to the starting position and try to get this team off the schneid in MAC play. Coming into this one, Tyree Shelton, Keon Mosey, they've been the 2 guys in the backfield. Tyree Shelton only had 23 yards on the ground last week. He's got 155 in the year with 3 touchdowns. Keon Mosey has had 360 yards with 1 touchdown on the ground. So look for that tandem out of the backfield to have themselves a nice game as well. Jalen Walker in the passing game was the most outstanding performer last week, but even then he still only had 3 receptions for 45 yards. He's got 141 yards on the season, but he is still looking for that beginning touchdown to start off his 2022 campaign coming into this one. Look for maybe Brett Gabbard to find him in the end zone at some point. Miles Marshall had an all right week last week with a touchdown and 19 yards on 1 reception. He's got 138 yards with 1 TD in the passing game thus far this year. Now turning towards the defense, we mentioned this is one of the best defenses in the MAC. In fact, in terms of yardage given up at 347 yards per game, they are the best in the MAC across the board. Ryan McWood, that 7th-year senior, just an absolute monster in the linebacking core. Had 11 total tackles last week, 64 total tackles on the year with 4 tackles for loss and 1 interception as well. Michael Dowell had a nice week as well last week, 17 total tackles. He's got 58 total tackles on the year with 1 forced fumble and 1 fumble recovery as well. So look for this Miami defense to really help the offense this week, maybe get a couple takeaways, ignite that offense, and see what they can't get going with Brett Gabbard back at the helm. That's the tale of the tape in this one. Miami looks to get off the schneid against Western Michigan here on Senior Day, also family weekend in Oxford. They look to pick up a much-needed win in the MAC to get them back to the 500 mark in MAC play. We'll be back with scoreboard and future segments on the pregame show here on Red Hawk Radio. Be sure to stay tuned in. And we're back here on Red Hawk Radio for our scoreboard segment prior to today's game between Miami and Western Michigan. Looking at the MAC from a simply score standpoint, nothing really crazy going on, but we'll break down all of those games. With 11:42 left in the fourth, Akron is losing to Kent State, who might remember a few weeks ago came to Yager Stadium and picked up a loss against the Miami RedHawks. But Kent State getting their vengeance against Akron, 33-24. With a little bit of time left in the fourth, Kent State looking to pull off that win against a huge rivalry opponent in Akron. Buffalo playing Toledo today, losing 20-7 with 14:53 in the third. This Buffalo team always at risk to score late in games, though. Miami knows that all too well in their game at Buffalo a few weeks ago. Buffalo finds themselves at 3-0 in the MAC, but Toledo looks to be just about too much to handle for Buffalo right now. Bowling Green, after a huge win against Miami last week, is winning 17-9 against Central Michigan with 14:53 left in the third. Not too much surprise there. Bowling Green, a team that has really surprised a lot of people this year, but certainly a good team nonetheless. With 10:56 left in the second, Eastern Michigan is tied with Ball State at 7 apiece. That game should be a good one going down the stretch. Eastern Michigan finds themselves at 1-2 in the MAC. Ball State, who is a heavy favorite to win their side of the MAC, coming in at 2-1. Could be some big implications there between those two teams. Ohio, after having a couple huge weeks with big wins against a couple teams, playing Northern Illinois super close, 7-3 the score there with 10:49 left in the second. So a lot of game left there. And Miami, Ohio, and Western Michigan, the only 3:30 kick in the MAC this week. We will have that action here later on Red Hawk Radio. Now let's turn to the top 25. Got a lot of big games unfolding, a lot going on later tonight. A few teams on idle weeks as well. A big amount of football action going on this weekend. Iowa is losing big time to the number 2 Ohio State Buckeyes with 8 minutes left in the fourth, 54-10. The score there. Iowa does have the ball. Ohio State was huge favorites in that game, but you always have to hold your breath after that one. 65-21 the score there with 13:12 left in the fourth. The Volunteers looking to make a push towards possibly a college football playoff at the end of this year. Clemson and Syracuse, whole lot of drama unfolding. DJ Uiagalelei getting benched by Dabo Swinney and company. They have regained the lead against undefeated Syracuse, 24-21, but Syracuse is driving with 4:36 left in the fourth. Cincinnati, not much surprise in SMU. They're up 29-20 with 5:09 left in the fourth. SMU did just score, however, so it will get turned back over to Cincinnati. At our 3:30 slate, Ole Miss heads into Death Valley to take on Brian Kelly and LSU. That should be a good game. Lane Kiffin's got his squad dialed in this year at 7-0 and 3-0 in the SEC. The Rebels look to pick up a much-needed win against a tough LSU team that's 5-2 and has really put some teams on watch this year in some of their games. UCLA and Oregon, the biggest game in the Pac-12 at 3:30 today. That's going to be a good one. 9 versus 10 matchup. 5-1 Oregon. They suffered that big loss to Georgia early in the year. People kind of wrote them off, but they are back and they are playing great football right now. DTR with UCLA and Chip Kelly, they have played a really good season this year. They're looking to keep their undefeated campaign alive against the Oregon Ducks. Texas takes on number 11 Oklahoma. They are having a really good team down there at Mississippi State this year, so a lot could happen in that game. Alabama, heavy favorites still, however. Also, the whiteout at Penn State, number 16 Nittany Lions take on Minnesota. PJ Fleck and company come to Happy Valley. Penn State looking to avenge that loss that they suffered to Michigan last week with a big win in their whiteout game. And our final game in the top 25, number 8 TCU, who's coming in at 6-0 after a huge win last week, will take on number 17 Kansas State at 5-1. That game on FS1 at 8 o'clock. That should be a great game to cap off the top 25. And that just about does it for our college football scoreboard. Thus, on the pregame show, be sure to stay tuned. I'll bring in our color guy for the week, Patrick. Going to talk about this matchup, what he likes, what he doesn't. Brett Gabbard coming back for the RedHawks. That's going to be a big storyline, especially with an offense that has struggled to this point this year. So we'll talk this game and Senior Day all together. Be sure to stay tuned on the pregame show here on Red Hawk Radio. We'll be back after a short break. And we're back here on the pregame show. I now welcome on Luke West Poley. Luke, this is a big matchup now. We got some huge news prior to the game. Brett Gabbard back in, penciled in as the starter for Miami. I mean, there's so much we could talk about. What does that mean to you right now? How does this change the Miami RedHawks approach to this game?
Oh, I mean, this is a whole different team, right? You look in years past at what Brett Gabbert has done for that this afternoon, but as of right now, he's the starter. Expect Miami to air the ball out quite a lot against a Western Michigan secondary that has really struggled over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, and you mentioned Brett Gabbert brings a ton of experience to the RedHawks on offense, over a 5,600-yard passer in his career, 41 touchdowns through the air. We mentioned, Luke, they're having a rough year in the secondary for Western Michigan. How do you expect Miami to really attack that, and what receivers do you think are going to have a big day because of that secondary issue that Western is having this year?
I think you look right at Mac Hippenhammer, right? It's his senior day, for number 0, the senior out of Fort Wayne. And yeah, he's had season lows the last 2 weeks, only 14 yards through the air last week in the loss against Bowling Green. I expect him to have a huge afternoon. Another guy is Miles Marshall. He was really good for the RedHawks last week. Chuck Martin said in his press conference coming in, there's a lot of question marks for that Indiana transfer coming in, that they're still kind of figuring out what is his game, what does he bring to the table. I expect Miles Marshall to answer a lot of those questions here this afternoon.
Yeah, and we can't talk about the passing game with Brett Gabbert without also recognizing the running game that opens up a lot of the passing game for him. Tyree Shelton, Keon Mosey, what do you love about that tandem? Obviously, they had a rough week last week, but how do you expect them to get back in the flow of things here at Yager today?
Yeah, I mean, this is a 4-man rushing attack. Mosey and Shelton are the 2 leaders, but you can also work in Kenny Tracy there, Kevin Davis as well. Those guys really struggle